What's up, everybody? Welcome to Heresy Financial. My name is Joe Brown, and today I'm going to answer the question definitively for you. Why do we pay taxes if they can just print money? I mean, we've spent the last how many months now debating about what size of a stimulus bill to pass, and we know that that's not going to be funded by taxes. That's not going to be funded by borrowing from people like you and me who are buying treasuries, or companies who are putting their money in savings by buying treasuries, loaning their money to the government. We know that that's just going to be funded by the Federal Reserve printing $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion, $2.5 trillion, however much it ends up being. And so it's bringing up the question again, why do we pay taxes when they can just print all the money they want? It's a fantastic question. So today we're answering, why do we pay taxes if they can just print? What would happen if we just stopped paying taxes, or they abolished all taxes and just used printing to finance all their spending instead? And then number three, what would happen if they did the opposite, where they abolished money printing and they could only spend through tax financed spending plans? Ready? Let's dive in. All right, we need to preface this talk with two things. Number one, what I'm describing here is the mechanics of how things work and the reasoning behind why the government and the people in power making their decisions are doing so. I'm not necessarily making a statement on, whether these things are effective or in most cases not effective, and or whether these things are moral or the good thing or the bad thing. I'm just saying, hey, here's the reason why they're doing it. And since it's the government doing it in most cases, that means it's bad and ineffective. And the second thing to note that we'll dive into a little bit in this video, but I'll cover it more in depth in another video at a later point, is that every dollar that the government spends is a dollar out of your pocket. There's no such thing as the government being able to spend money that doesn't come from somebody in its own, from the actual economy. Every dollar is extracted somehow because the government does not produce wealth. It can only redistribute wealth. Everything that the government does is some form of redistribution. It is not producing anything that it distributes from its own pocket. Okay, so number one, the big question, why do we pay taxes if they can just print all of the money that they need? And so it really comes down to two reasons that most people don't talk about, actually. If you look it up on CNBC or Investopedia, this is something that most people don't talk about. And I'll give credit where credit is due. One of the places that I would least expect to find the correct answer is from the MMT crowd, the Universal Basic Income crowd. And Stephanie Kelton, she's kind of the poster boy or poster girl for this economic philosophy, this movement. And in her recent book on modern monetary theory, she actually talks about this, and this is the main reason why it's still necessary for governments to charge taxes, even when money printing in an unlimited amount is possible. And it's because it creates demand for the currency. This is the first reason why taxes are still necessary and still charged. It creates demand for the currency. And so in her book, she uses a fantastic example of chores. Like if you've got kids and you want them to do chores, one idea that you could have as a parent is to create chore bucks. And you say, hey, if you do chores, then I'll give you some of these paper chore bucks that I print out on my computer printer. And every time you do a chore, you can I'll give you some of these chore bucks. Well, after the first couple of weeks, the parent would notice nobody's doing chores because this paper that I'm printing, my own chore bucks on, is kind of worthless, right? And so instead, what the parent does, kind of a modified plan to that approach is, or a modified approach to that plan is that the parent decides, okay, at the end of every week, I'm going to charge you, my kids, I'm going to charge you a certain number of chore bucks. And if you don't pay me chore bucks at the end of each week, whether it's 5 or 10 or however many, then you're going to be grounded for the next week. So all of a sudden, by way of having a punishment, you've instantly created demand for something that intrinsically has no value. It's just a piece of paper that you printed the word chore bucks on. And so without you forcing, the children will then go about doing their chores in order to make sure they accumulate enough chore bucks to be able to return some of them at the end of each week so that they don't get grounded. This is exactly what the patronizing government does to its citizens. It creates pieces of paper that have no intrinsic intrinsic value, and it says if you don't turn in a certain amount of these based off of your activity at the end of every year, we are going to ground you or put you in prison. So it's in conjunction with the monopoly on violence and the threat of imprisonment that the United States government creates demand for its currency by saying, we know this doesn't really have any intrinsic value, but if you don't give some of it back to us at the end of every year, you're going to jail. Now, you might be asking yourself the question right now, why is it important that there's demand for the currency? And that's simply because that's what the US government uses to spend so that it gets what it wants. And so if there was no demand for the currency, me as a vendor, if I was running a business, I wouldn't sell something to the United States government and accept their printed currency as payment for my services or my products unless I knew that there was some demand for that currency, that I could go take that currency and spend it elsewhere. And so it's important to the government that their currency has some sort of demand to it. Otherwise, nobody will accept it, and the government needs people to accept their money so that they can spend it on the things that they want. Now, the second and lesser reason why taxes are still charged even when the government can print as much money as it wants is to redistribute resources. Now, this one is a little bit more insidious, even though the first one is actually pretty insidious itself. This one is a little bit more insidious because you don't technically need to tax in order to redistribute resources. Because remember what I said at the beginning, and I'll go into this a little bit more in detail, every dollar the government spends is wealth that's extracted from one area or another of the economy. And so when it inflates, it's still extracting wealth out of the economy in one form or another. And so by the fact that it redistributes resources via taxation by lowering the wealth in one area to raise the wealth in another area, taxing the rich, welfare for the poor, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't technically have to directly tax the rich in order to make payments to the poor, because the government can just print that money. But because of the optics of inequality and some people having, a large percentage of wealth of the total economy versus, the majority of others, because of those optics, usually taxes are used in order to try and at least look like they are, having the intention of dealing with the problem of inequality. And add on to that the fact that it doesn't actually work most of the time, that anytime you try and redistribute resources via any sort of policy, usually the wealth still concentrates in the hands of a few. So it doesn't attack the underlying problem of inequality. It just changes the hands of who holds the majority of the wealth from the competent to the politicians, from the producers to the well-connected. So that brings up the question, what would happen then if we just completely abolished all taxes whatsoever and funded all government spending via inflation? Would that be good, bad? What would the effects be? Well, number one, this means that government spending would be either allowed or disallowed by the Federal Reserve, because they're the ones that do the money printing. And ultimately, in a hypothetical situation like this, that would probably be completely folded underneath the U.S. government so that it wouldn't be independent anymore. And so we can kind of, assume for the purposes of this argument that that's the case, that every dollar the government wants to spend, it can just print. And it doesn't have to go through the legal loopholes of relying on the Federal Reserve, an outside entity, to do that for them. The first thing that would happen is that you would remove all spending limits on the government. They wouldn't have to pass any new bills, pass any new laws for new taxes in certain areas. There would be no restrictions on spending. They would just be able to print to fund anything, and the only limits on their spending would be self-imposed limits. Now, you might be looking at this and thinking, hey, that's great. You might be looking at this and thinking, hey, that's a big problem. The number one key to remember here is that inflation, money printing, is still technically a tax. And by a tax, I mean that it is money that's extracted from the economy. And here's why. Money isn't wealth. Money represents ownership, or a percentage stake of ownership of wealth of a society. So when you have a dollar bill, that's not wealth itself. That represents ownership of $1 worth of the total wealth in the economy, and you can use that, you can exchange that for, a good or a service. And so you can think of a pie chart when you're thinking of all of the dollars in an economy. What this means is that anytime new money is printed, that means your percentage ownership in the economy gets smaller. So your little sliver of pie that represents how many dollars as a percentage, how many dollars you own of the total economic wealth, that means your piece of the pie actually shrinks whenever new dollars are being printed. Another way to state this is that your dollars can't buy as much stuff because they're not worth as much because there's more dollars relative to the same amount of goods and services available in the economy. If you double the amount of dollars that everybody has, pretty much instantly you would double the prices of everything because every dollar is worth half as much as it was before. Now you might be thinking, well, what's the problem with that? Why is that such an issue? And mainly it's because of who gets screwed the most in situations like this. The people who own things benefit because their price goes up, and the people who own mostly dollars and less things get screwed because their ownership of all available things goes down and their ability to acquire those things goes down. And so another way to say this is that the poor people are the ones who get screwed and the rich people are the ones who get benefited by money printing. And so as much as we've seen inequality skyrocket since 1971, which has been a lot since we left the gold standard and gave the government the ability to spend ever more increasing amounts of money, and we've seen inflation take off, as much as that's hurt poor people, it would hurt them even more if we removed taxation as the way to fund all spending or some spending, and in its place we replaced it with all inflationary funding. And so this would hurt the poor because they're the ones that have the most dollars as a percentage of their own wealth compared to owning assets like houses or things. And they're the ones that don't own stocks. And they're the ones that have to buy the more expensive things. And it would benefit the people who own the things and who are selling things that are going up in price and who own assets like, houses, real estate, and stocks. And so basically all the problems that we've seen over the last few decades pop up as a result of more and more inflation and more money printing, a larger supply of money. Those would be expedited, and they would happen. So they would increase so quickly that you would see a toppling in society pretty quickly with a move like that. It wouldn't take long before the value of the dollar just became worthless because the government would spend it so fast and create so much more of it so quickly that it would destroy its own value. And since you wouldn't be required by law to turn any in at the end of the year because you don't have the taxes due anymore, there'd really be no incentive to hold on to any. And so people would just start using new forms of money that held their value better instead. And finally, the question, what would happen then if we did the opposite and completely outlawed money printing and only allowed the government to spend money that it could tax or borrow, which is just another form of taxation because it would have to be repaid back then with tax dollars in the future. So what if that was the only way and we completely eliminated the possibility of inflationary spending? Well, the first thing I'd like to mention that, there's a lot of gold bugs out there and Austrian economists and people, the people who are more for liberty and freedom, who talk about, the benefits of a system like this and getting more towards, what the Constitution says should happen, more towards getting away from inflationary spending, maybe more towards, maybe a gold standard. And the one thing that they don't talk about enough is the short-term pain that would be brought along by something like this happening. And so that's the first thing that would happen if we made a move like this. You would see a lot of short-term pain, and it would be pretty devastating actually because almost our entire economy right now is built on boatloads of debt and zombie companies and inflated asset prices and government spending, and there's just a whole a massive amount of our economy and our nation that's built on this really rocky foundation. And if we cut out the the ever increasing amounts of air that are being blown into the bubble, even though there's holes that are keeping this thing inflated, it would instantly kind of collapse, and you'd see, even though they're bad things, you would see them all collapse. You'd see a lot of joblessness, a lot of unemployment, a lot of massive wealth destruction happen all at once, lots of bankruptcies. You'd see massive devastation, and there'd be very real pain, which is why nobody's ever done something like this and gone in that direction, because it's political suicide to bring on this amount of pain. You'd very quickly see a default on debt because the debt load is so big right now. The nation doesn't produce enough wealth to pay off that debt load, and the only way that it's being paid off is through money printing. And so you'd see an outright default on debt. You'd see a default on debt from a bunch of companies as well, because interest rates would skyrocket. Nobody's going to lend money for free when something like this is happening. And so you'd see interest rates skyrocket, asset bubbles would collapse, real estate prices would crash, stock prices would crash. So you'd see massive pain pretty much all across the board. And subsequently, you would see a massively healthy recovery where everything that was built after that from the rubble, assets that survived would be the ownership would be transferred to more competent hands. People would become savers instead of spenders and borrowers. You'd see a much more healthy, robust, and solid foundation be built that would produce an era of real growth and wealth and productivity that would not be subject to the fragility that our current system is built on. Now we can all smile and dream about with wishful thinking a society like this that doesn't and might never exist, at least here in the USA. But if you are looking for a way to take your investing, your trading to the next level, my advanced options course is coming out very soon, coming out later this week. And so if you've been waiting patiently for that, I really appreciate it. It's coming out soon. It's the best guide to advanced options trading that you will find anywhere on the internet. So stay tuned. That is coming out shortly. And as always, I really appreciate you guys. You're the best. Have a great day.